For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon de Rehove. Political analyst Aubrey Machiki joins me to discuss the Jacob Zuma spy tapes and what they could mean for him and the future of South African politics. The DA has fought a court battle for over 5 years to force the NPA to hand over the so-called spy tapes, which Helen Zille has said have enough evidence to prosecute Jacob Zuma. Can you provide the history of this case and elaborate on why these tapes are so critical?
Well, I start in August 2003, when the former head of the NPA, Bulelani Ngcuka, made a statement to the media in which he said he had a prima facie case of corruption against Jacob Zuma, but because he did not think the NPA had a winnable case, he would not proceed. So that's where the problem started, because some people responded by saying he was engaging in trial by innuendo. And then thereafter, the supporters of Jacob Zuma, when charges of corruption were laid against him in 2005, started arguing that he was a victim of political intrigue or a political conspiracy. In fact, when charges of corruption, fraud, money laundering, and racketeering were withdrawn against him in April 2009, 2 weeks before the election, the main argument that was used by the acting head of the NPA then, Mokotedi Mpie, was precisely that there was a political conspiracy against Jacob Zuma, and some people in the Scorpions, in the NPA, acting in collusion sometimes with people outside these institutions, tried to time his arrest so that he would not be able to attend the Polokwane conference in December 2007, and therefore would not be able to challenge Thabo Mbeki for the position of president. Now, what happened subsequently is that then the DA argued that the grounds that had been invoked by the NPA to justify the withdrawal of charges were not sufficient to drop those charges. And therefore, in the view of the DA, the withdrawal was both unlawful and irrational. Now, what is interesting with regard to where we are now, 5 years since the DA launched the legal challenge, is that now the DA has listened to the tapes. Now, when the DA says it has evidence that the withdrawal of the charges against the president was unlawful and irrational, what it is suggesting is that what they have heard in the tapes does not constitute sufficient grounds for the withdrawal of charges against Jacob Zuma. And of course, if they are correct, and this view is supported by a court judgment, we are looking at the possibility of the Constitutional Court finding that indeed the decision was unlawful and irrational. And the question that arises is whether at that point, when the matter is thrown back to the NPA will reinstate charges against Jacob Zuma or not. But another thing that is interesting for me is that the DA has listened to 36 conversations. Now, actually, there may be evidence of a conspiracy in these tapes by people other than those who were mentioned by Mokotedi when he withdrew charges of corruption against Zuma. And the question would be then, how does the DA, because these tapes are going to become public at some point, manage that? Because you can't rule out the possibility that some of the individuals who were taped are individuals we believe are paragons of virtue.
In August 2003, Bulelani Ngcuka, the former National Director of Public Prosecutions, said the state had a prima facie case against Zuma. If this was the case, why was Zuma not prosecuted?
Well, it goes back to the political conspiracy that, rightly or wrongly, the NPA believed in 2009 that the tapes contained evidence of a political conspiracy, and therefore the conspiracy had poisoned the whole corruption matter. And on that basis, it felt justified to withdraw charges of corruption. the question that has to be asked is, even if the tapes contain evidence of a political conspiracy, was the political conspiracy sufficient grounds for the withdrawal of charges against Jacob Zuma? But the fact that the tapes may contain evidence of this conspiracy, as suggested by the NPA in 2009, raises much larger issues about the manipulation of state institutions in pursuit of what are very narrow political goals. Or alternatively, it raises the larger question of how, because of internal battles inside the ANC, and because the ANC is such a dominant party, state institutions may get sucked into what are essentially internal ANC battles.
Do you believe the actions of the NPA and the Scorpions were part of a political conspiracy against Zuma? If so, does this mean that Zuma should not be prosecuted?
My own view, rightly or wrongly, is that we're dealing with two things. We are dealing with a conspiracy against Jacob Zuma, and the charges against him were withdrawn as a result of a counter-conspiracy by his supporters. So we're dealing with those two. Whether the conspiracy against Zuma was sufficient grounds for the withdrawal of charges is another matter altogether. But another larger question that arises is this: how did private citizens gain access to state intelligence resources? It's another question we have to ask.
Do you believe the DA's SCA victory is the beginning of the end for Zuma? Can you elaborate on that?
I agree with Helen Zille that it is the end of the beginning, to the extent that, armed with those tapes, the DA can go and do a review application to challenge the 2009 decision. Now, whether it is the beginning of the end for Jacob Zuma is actually a political question in this sense. I am convinced that this matter is going all the way to the Constitutional Court, so we may be looking at another 2 years before we get a final decision. Now, if the final decision is that the decision is unlawful and irrational, the Constitutional Court usually defers to the decision maker or the policy maker. So what they will probably do is to say, your decision, NPA, was irrational and unlawful. Go and cure the defects. In the process of curing the defects, the NPA must then decide whether it comes to the same conclusions that Mgode Dimpie came to. Now, of course, if they don't come to the same conclusion, then they must then decide whether they are reinstating charges of corruption against Jacob Zuma. Now, the political question arises if the NPA decides to reinstate the charges of corruption against Zuma. The question is, what kind of political defense will be put up, and what kind of pressure politically will be brought to bear on the NPA to avoid a situation that leads to the reinstatement of charges against Jacob Zuma. On the other hand, if the lame duck factor kicks in somewhere between now and 2019, then what Jacob Zuma desires may not matter too much to many in the ANC, so he might not have sufficient political cover, in which case the reinstatement might occur. But if it does occur, politically, you might see the quickest pardon you have ever seen in South African history, you know. So it depends on how these different scenarios pan out. But ordinarily, the moment a court decides the decision to withdraw charges against Jacob Zuma was unlawful and irrational, ordinarily should resign. You and I know that's not going to happen. But also what you and I know is that if the NPA decides not to reinstate charges against Jacob Zuma when a court has found that the decision was unlawful and irrational. The DA will go back to court to challenge that decision too.
DA leader Helen Zille implies a long battle ahead when she says that getting access to the spy tapes is the end of the beginning. How do you see matters unfolding from here? Do you think the DA will find enough ammunition in the spy tapes to launch a court application to review the decision not to prosecute President Zuma?
Well, there's an irony here. We have so far assumed that Jacob Zuma's fate will be determined by the ANC and inside the ANC. If you look at how the spy tape saga is unfolding, his fate may depend actually on another party, the DA. But as to how far the DA is prepared to go with this matter, beyond the point where you have a scenario in which the court has found that yes, the decision was irrational, but the NPA decides no, we're not going to reinstate charges against him. Beyond that point, whether the DA takes the battle further depends on what has happened to Helen Zille in the meantime. Because you can't rule out the possibility that either she will not stand for re-election in 2015 or she will stand and lose, in which case her successor may not be interested in taking the battle further.
How does this whole sordid episode make you feel as a South African? How did the country get into such a messy predicament?
Well, writing elsewhere, I said that the fact that you had a conspiracy, possibly a counter-conspiracy, the fact that private citizens gained access to state intelligence resources, which suggests not only a manipulation of state institutions, but also that people deployed in the states took sides in what was essentially an internal ANC battle. Bugs me, and it bugs me big time.
That was political analyst Aubrey Machiki discussing the so-called spy tapes.